Data binding is the means by which data is automatically transported to and from a UI element in the layout. You may not bind the UI elements to the context nodes or attributes defined in another controller. UI elements are private to the view controller in which they are declared. The data binding process separates the UI element object from the application code in the view controller. Therefore, to manipulate UI element properties, the application code in the view controller needs only to manipulate the values of the context nodes and the attributes to which the UI elements are bound. The Dynpro framework then performs the following tasks. It transports data from the context attribute to the UI element during the screen rendering process. It repopulates the context attribute from the UI element after data has been entered and the next server round trip is initiated. The values entered are automatically converted and checked for type conformity. If an error occurs, an appropriate message is displayed. Data binding is a powerful instrument because not only can the value of a UI element be bound to a context attribute, but the properties of a UI element can also be bound. For example, visibility. This means that UI element properties can be manipulated from the view controller by acting on the context attributes. Now we want to have a look at how this data binding and context mapping looks like in a real Web Dynpro component. Here's the initial SAP Web Dynpro component. And let's first have a look at the component controller, because the component controller usually is defined as the mapping origin node. So whatever data structures you may need in your Web Dynpro component, you will most probably define it in your component controller first. By default, we end up on the context tab, and what we see here on the first level, these are the context nodes. And when we expand the nodes, we see the attributes. These nodes are independent nodes. You see, for each node you can define the properties. Here's something we will discuss later in more detail. Now, very likely that these nodes are used in the view for the data transport. So let's open the view. Here by default we end up on the layout tab, but we should never start with the layout. We look at the context. And here we see that we have more context nodes than we saw actually in the component controller. This is because some of the component controller nodes are mapped to the view, and some nodes exist only in the view. They have no link to the component controller. There's no mapping. When you look here at these icons, work list is something that we have seen in the component controller already. There's a tiny blue arrow pointing to the right hand side. This is indicating that there's a mapping between the main view and the component controller. You see here there's the same node displayed. When we look at the second node, properties doesn't have this blue arrow, which means it doesn't exist anywhere else, just in the view, and there's no mapping. It's an independent node. What else happens when we create such a mapping between the nodes? That one controller starts using the other controller. And this is normally a unidirectional relationship. When we look here at the properties tab of the view, then we see that there's a table containing used controllers or components. And we see here on the first line, it's the very same component we're talking about here. And we're using the component controller. So the view here is using the component controller. And this is right now only because we have context mapping. Now let's have a look at the data binding. Data binding is something here that takes place between the view, context, and the view layout. So this is how the data is transferred from component controller or backend to component controller in the component controller context, from component controller context to view controller context, and then from the view controller context through data binding to the view's UI elements, to the layout, without a single line of coding. And therefore we have to look into the view, and when we look here at the layout, we see that this is the layout structure or the hierarchy, and we see that here for the table, the work list table, there is a data source property, and this data source property says there's a binding. When we click this button, the pop-up is showing us the view's context. You see the map nodes and the non-map nodes. So here I can enable data transfer between the context and the layout in a pretty easy way. Another element is this here, system, which is contained in the tables toolbar. It's this one. And here we have to scroll down a bit, and then we see the value of this UI element. The value property of this UI element also has a binding. Now we want to enhance our first Dynpro application. We want to add a text view UI element that displays a simple hello world. Then we want to create an application, see the URL, and start the application from inside the ABAP Workbench. So first navigate back to our own Dynpro. Now that was forward. This is our current structure. And we're not dealing with the context right now, we're just creating a UI element. So we have to have change mode available. Here's the text view that we want to add. We can add it directly from here, or we click on the root UI element container. The root UI element container is simply our background. Right click it, insert element, text view, here we go. Now you don't see the text view in the layout. This is because it doesn't display anything yet, and we also see in the properties of the text view that one of those properties is displayed in red, which means for this property it's mandatory to have an entry. So let's enter hello world. Here we are. So this is a simple hello world in Dynpro. Now we have to activate this view. And now we create a Dynpro application. We right click our component, create Dynpro application. If we do it with right click on the component, then it will automatically accept the component name as application name. First Dynpro demo is our description. And when you now look at the application properties here, then you see there's the URL. Then the URL is generated. Depending on the profile parameter, what is the full qualified host name, it builds up the URL. This is the path to our application, which we will also be able to see in transaction SICF, the Internet Communication Framework, there in the service tree. All right, the application is new, which means not saved. There's no activation necessary here because there's no ABAP involved, no code generated. Save it. Create the service in SICF. And then test it. Here we go. You see now we have a new node here on the left hand side in our Trivio Dynpro application, which means we could create another application as well. Let me quickly show you where in transaction SICF you can see this Dynpro application now and can then deactivate or activate it. So we can, if we know our service name directly, type it in here. We know it, but I want to show you the hierarchy. So we execute default host SAP BC, scroll all the way down, Dynpro, SAP. It's quite a lot. Dynpro is already there from SAP. Then we scroll again until we see our Z application. Here we are. And now with right click, you can deactivate and then again activate. This concludes the second lecture.